was its most horrific execution in French history. In 1757, a lunatic named Robert-François Damiens made an attempt on the life of Louis XV, charging his royal carriage and stabbing him with a penknife. He caused the king only a minor injury, from which he quickly recovered, but the consequences he faced for his actions would be ghastly. Robert was easily apprehended and subjected to torture to reveal co-conspirators by means of a device called the boot, which crushed and flayed his legs, but he insisted that he had acted alone. However, his real punishment had yet to begin. Louis himself was a jovial and forgiving sort and, incredibly, wished for Robert to be pardoned for his actions. But in a rare move, the Grand Chamber of Parliament overruled the king, charging Robert with regicide, the ultimate crime of king-killing even though he had not succeeded. And for these highest of crimes, the Ancien regime sentenced Robert to death by the worst possible punishment, quartering. Now, quartering hadn't taken place in France since 1609, then for the actual killing of a king, so the execution generated a lot of public interest. It would be set up as an elaborate pay-per-view event, complete with prime viewing seats, carnival snacks, and royal executioners with no experience in carrying out such a task. On the morning of the execution, Robert laconically remarked, "The day will be hard." The first part of the procedure went largely to plan. Robert's offending hand, the one which had stabbed the king, was smelted off by a mixture of molten sulfur, resin, and lead. In the next stage, the flesh of his arms, legs, and chest were ripped away by red-hot pinchers, into which the gaping wounds were filled with the same molten residue. He was then castrated, but still very much alive, leading into the next phase. Robert was now to be pulled apart by 4 horses, with a limb fastened to each one, but this didn't go to plan. With no detailed instructions to go by, the executioners didn't know what type of horses, ropes, knots, or overall mechanics to employ. All this meant that the horses spent hours struggling to tear the man apart, so that eventually 2 more had to be attached, and yet still were unsuccessful, one of the horses even collapsing from the effort. Meanwhile, the protracted spectacle and agonizing screams traumatized much of the Parisian crowd, including a traveling Italian, the famous Giovanni Casanova, who wrote that he repeatedly had to avert his gaze and hold his ears. Even the executioners themselves were deeply tormented by the debacle, as their craft devolved into a hellish farce. Eventually, Robert's limbs were sufficiently loosened by cutting through to the bone around his thighs and armpits with an axe, so that the horses could finally succeed. Apparently, the remaining torso still showed minor signs of life as it was burnt on a pyre. The execution had lasted 4 hours. Of the 2 head executioners, the young 18-year-old Charles-Henri Sanson was too disturbed to complete his duties that day, while his older uncle would resign immediately afterwards. The king, while not present, vomited when detailed on the day's events. It was to be the last quartering ever. 30 years later, when the Ancien regime fell in the French Revolution, the old methods of execution were replaced by the relative mercy of the guillotine. Ironically, the younger Sanson, still in employment, would go on to oversee the decapitation of Louis XV's son, Louis XVI, and his queen, Marie Antoinette.